Hi, welcome to this session where we're going to try to figure out how to do some security labels for COVID apps. And we have Adam and Dermot from the COVID Safe Path apps. And this is actually quite exciting because I think this is the kind of activity that can help to move the needle forward on a lot of things and reward good security practices, which is exactly what this team is doing. And there was actually just a keynote that Adam delivered, which I highly recommend you to see. And there's a bunch of sessions we've done last week and this week on threat modeling, which again are really good preparation material for this. But Adam, welcome. And actually, could you just answer again? Sorry, that question of if if you're a corporate, non-security company would like to be involved, how could you do that?
Thank you. Yeah, so there is ways for everyone to get involved. There is as many disciplines involved in the project as there are in any startup or corporate, ranging from PR, marketing, training, implementation, project management, exploratory testing, automated testing, security, R&D, security testing. There's everything in there. So I'd encourage any company or individual that's interested to go to covidsafepaths.org and sign up to the project, get access to Slack, all the documentation, etc. And anyone that wants to discuss further how they can contribute without necessarily doing that can reach out to me on Twitter. It's @LeonSmith on Twitter.
So actually, one of the questions I had for you in this is that, are you also considering, or you know anybody using this technology or your app, not from a health authority, but from a company point of view?
That's a great question. So I don't believe yet, but that is a target use case, private sector employer, yes, or a institution like a university. Now the needs, the privacy design, etc., may be different. But if I look at this as an employer in the UK, I have under the Health and Safety at Work Act, I have to perform a risk assessment on putting my staff in an office. Yeah. And there's a foreseeable risk that one of them will have COVID-19 at some point over the next year, 2 years, however long this goes on. So I have to take reasonable steps to manage that risk and manage at least the impact if that happens on other staff. So how can I do that as an employer? Exactly the same way a government does it: testing, tracking, and tracing. So I think the market for businesses, particularly things like factories and office workers where people are in a very confined location, I think there's a huge market there for contact tracing and exposure notification. And I feel that employees will be more willing to install an app that their employer provides, particularly if it's managed independently, than they will something like the NHS app. But time will tell.
Yeah, and I think that also provides a very interesting sustainability path, because that can create your revenue streams that support the application, support the testing, support the things that will be required as this gets more usage and more serious. So and it's something that is tangible, right? And it's also interesting because you can make certain modifications that, for example, you can only track when you are in the office, right? So it's almost like, and this is addresses a little bit, I think, a variation that we talked, I think a couple of times, where, I'm a little bit worried that the tracing agent is a bottleneck, and it's one of those elements in the if you look at the threat model, if you look at the multiple paths that you can go through, I feel that that's one of those that can be thrown out of the window in a whole number of scenarios, right? Some completely justified, some maybe a bit twisting the situation a little bit. But if you look at a situation where, and we actually look at this internally, right? So when we were looking at our as a company, how we would react to the COVID situation, we went from this whole thing of, if somebody gets infected in the office, we'll shut down the whole thing, to like, look, let's assume that it will happen. There will be, situations where, by now somebody infected might go to the office. Although we did shut down before the whole thing became more real. But I remember that one of the paths that we were talking about was how to trace who was in contact with those individuals at that moment in time, right? So, and also, for example, like we on our go back to office strategy, we're thinking of doing in phases. So we're thinking of doing a smaller percentage of the crowd can go, then maybe a bigger one. And when they're there, we can probably already mark certain areas in the office as, zones for that individual, which actually from an employee point of view is better because, we have a young workforce, a lot of developers, and they're really struggling at home, right? They're really, they're almost like the social interaction, right? Even if it's a 2 meter away, right? It's still better than, being stuck in your office, right? Also in your home, right? Some of them are, they don't have families, like there's definitely a social element to it that is very harsh. So I really would like the idea to go to my team and say, look, everybody install this. We geofence this so that the only times we're tracking it is when you're inside the office, literally, because all we want to know is when one of you guys get it and you were symptomatic, we need to go back and track who was in the office at that moment in time so that we can then, trigger again the tracing and the testing, right, process. And I think what's
yes,
nice about that, sorry, go on.
I think there's a few things there. So there's a few pieces of functionality that would be more relevant in an employer situation, such as automatically turning it on and off at different times of the day, geofencing, also potentially providing some kind of management information on utilization of the app, which you probably wouldn't do at a national level. In terms of the protocols that you use, I mean, there's pros and cons. So you're perfectly right to say the contact tracing may be too much of a bottleneck because the time between infection and notification is crucial to stop secondary and tertiary infections. Yeah. There's various downsides with an automated exposure notification process, though. The false positives, the false negatives, you can leave your phone over there and go and talk to someone over there. And on a proximity-based solution, that would not pick up a contact. On a GPS-based solution with a contact tracer, though, they may take a more conservative approach. Oh, yes, that was a party, need the names of all the people there, anyone you might have spoken to. So there's pros and cons to each. And there's also other things that may be more relevant for employers, such as QR codes that you scan on your phone when you enter a zone, beacon and radio-based solutions that are at fixed points in the office. Dermot, I don't know if you've got anything to add on that. You're on mute.
Yeah, I was just going to add, but you've got to it in the end that we're actively looking at beacons, both Bluetooth and Wi-Fi beacons, which we think are an important part of a solution for office and university deployments, and may extend to general public situations as well. So, restaurants and other venues may want to deploy beacons, etc. That's not been part of our initial kind of rollout plan because it relies on a bunch of infrastructure being rolled out. When you're looking at a business, an individual business that's wanting to track their employees, that becomes quite a straightforward thing to do. Once you're starting to look at, citywide rollout of beacon infrastructure across all the venues in a city or something like that, that's, obviously a larger undertaking. But yeah, there are definitely other aspects of technology that you might bring in. And then, depending on how effective those are, then you may want to drop out the GPS tracking bit, which may not be particularly useful for a business scenario. So we're kind of seeing this as a really trying to develop a kind of a modular framework where different use cases can kind of plug in and drop out different modules, whether it's the GPS, whether it's the the Bluetooth proximity stuff, or whether it's sort of proximity beacons and so on for different use cases. Yep.
And then I guess the beauty of open source, right, is that, in a way, this can happen regardless, right? If you initially involved or not. I actually think that you kind of need to encourage that, right? Because that kind of innovation is the kind of thing that it will bring again to the mothership, right? A lot of great, innovation and great sort of expertise that otherwise will be hard to do, right?
Yeah, and the challenge we have there is one of the things we're kind of consciously looking at is how do we create an open source environment, and this kind of relates to what I was talking about, the sort of pluggable modules, where people who want to do something different that we haven't done yet do it in a way that fits into our framework, rather than just kind of forking our code and going off and kind of adding their own thing in a way that doesn't make it reusable by anybody else. So we're trying to develop that architecture to give people a natural way to extend the product in a kind of a way that's consistent with all the other extensions of the product, and it'll hopefully kind of play nicely with other bits, so that people can pick and choose the different modules they deploy. The alternative is we just end up with dozens and dozens of different forks that all do different things, but you can't actually pull it together in any kind of coherent way. So that's a key thing we're trying to do in terms of the overall architecture of the product and the repository.
Yeah, but I think, and I have to say, like I at the company I'm working for, like one of the shifts I'm making internally is the mentality to think that we are an SDK company. We are we basically provide APIs, right? We provide infrastructure for others to integrate with our product. And I think that, the reality is that you want as many forks as you want, right? Forks are good, right? The interesting balance is to make it uneconomical to fork too far, right? Because remember that you're going to be pushing fixes, you're going to be pushing, all sorts of improvements. And there's there's a good saying, it's the open source tax, right? So if you fork but don't contribute back, then you have to maintain, right? Then you have a massive overhead, where if you fork and push back your changes, then you don't have to maintain those changes, right? And that is a model that is been working quite well, right? And
yeah.
All right, cool. So what I kind of wanted to do here, right, is that I feel, let me just maybe walk you through the inspiration for this, right? So I'm a big fan of maturity models, right? I think we had some really good conversations yesterday, even on third-party governance. So there was a really good session where we're talking about how to scale third-party governance of vendors, right? Third-party vendor governance. And it's a massive problem at the moment industry, because the more there's a security awareness, the more there is a want to control your supply chain, the more you have all these sort of questions and requirements being pushed downstream, right? Which actually you'll find that any, for example, corporate environment that has a good security team will probably do the same thing to your app, right? They won't install it, and unless they make sure that there's a bunch of things that you do, all the security requirements, etc., right? And the governance and all that jazz. So I'm kind of always been a big fan of maturity models, because they allow kind of an evolution of the requirements. So when you look at OS, do you look at SAM, the software assurance maturity model? Because so one of the things that it provides, it kind of provides a really nice way to also capture, right, a lot of the things that you're doing and you're not doing, but also does do it, when you look at this, kind of in levels. So the logic would be that, you're not going to be, level 3 across the board all the time, but you might, it's almost like allows it to map where you are, and then the kind of strategy of what you want to do moving forward, right? So it's a really cool project, which it kind of fits almost at a higher level than the testing guide and ASVS, because this also looks a lot about your practices, looks about are you doing testing, are you doing security assessments, do you have governance? There's a lot of very cool stuff. Of course, there's a bit of overlap. And then, the other thing I also, for me, was very big on these maturity models is what we really need is to create something like this, right? And there's an element that I think is very important on this app, which is if you have a situation where you need to, a lot of other players are going to be implementing the app, right? You need a standard way to measure where they are in their security. And it was very interesting, I think, when you saw, the Simon's initial response, right, on that session, where you could see that he was, and I think it comes from a more of a business point of view. And you kind of saw that there was an interesting element of like, hey, this is great data, let's capture it because we might need it, at future stage. You kind of saw that, which actually is a very valid business reaction, right? Every time, I build systems for business, there's always this tendency to go, let's harvest the data, right? What wrong would it be, right? Let's just collect everything. And even if we don't need it, we might need it in the future. And what I like about the approach you've taken is the other way around, right? So you're taking the data minimization approach. And I actually think that it's a great asset, right? Especially the more you minimize the data, the more you minimize where sensitive data exists, the less problems, right? Or the less attack surface you have. So I feel that one of the challenges is how do you control in a way, or how do you keep visibility into all the different implementations that will exist of your environment? Because my understanding is that you're pushing that to the health authorities, right?
Yes. For people that have been diagnosed, yes.
Yes. No, I'm saying, but even the infrastructure, right? Even the setup and the whole thing is run by a health authority.
Well, we're kind of we're working through this, and I think we're going to end up with a couple of different models, and it's not yet clear which one is going to win. The early engagements we've had with the health departments have all been we want to run this infrastructure ourselves. As we're looking at scaling this out, we're concerned about the overheads involved in that. And so we're starting to have more conversations about kind of SaaS type hosted models. And I think we're starting to get a little bit more traction and acceptance from health authorities that they may actually want something, that effectively we can deploy for them in the cloud on a SaaS basis. So it is very much an ongoing conversation. We started off very much looking at we'll provide technology for the health departments to deploy, but it's moving potentially quite fast in multiple directions. But of course, everyone who's deploying this has their own opinion of how they want to do it.
So I would strongly advise you to consider both models, right? Mm-hmm. and use the dedicated model as the foundation, right? So and there's a lot of important design decisions that if you go to a pure SaaS model, or if you start to go into a SaaS model, you will start to it's very easy to create things that only work in your environment. It's very easy to create things that suddenly not easy to break one place to the other. And in fact, when you go to the SaaS model, for example, the model that we're now pursuing is to go for single tenants for everybody. In fact, we got to the point where we actually create a dedicated AWS account per customer. And what that gives you, does that make sense from a sort of an architecture point of view? So instead of you having multi-tenant, i.e., you add security and you try to make sure that things are, a little bit segmented and separated across multiple customers, which was the original design that we had, right? For me, not only from a reliability and engineering and performance and scalability, also especially for security, the model we're going is a model where in AWS, we have an AWS organization and Azure organization, and we actually create dedicated accounts per customer, which now we manage with single sign-on. It's actually, really good from a management point of view. But what it means that, so we handle files, right? So one of the questions we get asked is, where's my files? Who has access to my files? What happens if, you got a problem? So this situation, because everything is one account, right? It all stays within that one account, right? So even if there's a problem, it's only within one particular account. But the way we're designing it is we're creating almost like an off-the-shelf solution that we can spin up on any cloud, not just ours, but the customer's one. So you almost get the same code base, can be run literally on your laptop. So we're going Kubernetes native. So we're having a mode where we can run everything from Kubernetes. But then if we run it on AWS, we're going to replace some of the components with native AWS modules. If we run it on Azure, we're replacing some key components as AWS model. And that's what we want to do with Google Cloud. So we can support Google Cloud, but we'll just run it off the Kubernetes cluster, right? And the advantage of that is that you have one code base that addresses locally, literally on your laptop, on any customer's environment, any server that you have, and then cloud offerings.
And that would be ideal if we had a cloud agnostic, set of Terraform scripts or something. We just give those to a healthcare authority and it spins up the whole infrastructure. Yes. That would be nirvana.
Well, look, to be fair, it's not that hard. It's a design principle, right? The problem you have is if you don't start there, you first of all get sucked into the cloud's really clever game, right? Of some features that are just wrappers around other open source technology, but suddenly, right, you get stuck on it. And then you can't move around. But also from a testing point of view, for example, it's very important to be able to spin up your entire environment, right? One of the biggest problems you have with testing, especially when you want to do continuous deployment pipelines, is very hard after a while to spin up realistic environments, right? So what I'm actually getting is I'm getting my test team to be a big driver of that because they need it anyway, right? And because we actually need to spin up multiple environments, which is actually sometimes what you want to do, right? You want to compare one to the other. You want to do all sorts of things. You want to run environments on new bits of code base. So it's very important to be able to spin up an entire environment and then destroy it completely, very, very easy. And when I look at your infrastructure, right, like it's Node application, right? It's a Node.js app with, with a client, like, at the moment, you don't have a very complicated tech stack, right?
No.
So
to be honest, it's a back end, it's a couple of services and a web server.
Yeah. And it was interesting because I remember that when I was trying to run it, even the instructions were already like, you do this, you do that, you set the database, you go like that. I felt like, where's the Docker up, right? Where's the Docker Compose up, right? Where's my one Docker image that I can just run the whole thing? It's like, but also it makes it that easy, right?
Agree. We do actually use Docker in CI for spinning up the test environments, exactly as you were saying.
Yeah. But you see, but so if you go back to that point, right? Like, so first of all, I definitely think you will need, and by the way, if you don't do it, somebody else will, but you need to embrace the cloud service because for a lot of health providers, that will be the simplest solution, right? And even for the teams that start saying they don't want to, right? Once they see the cost and the requirements and the effort, especially from a security point of view, they're going to go, well, actually, can we use yours, right? And this is one where I actually think that you need to look at the commercial model for this, right? Because you have to make it sustainable at your end too, right? That kind of infrastructure, really, you'll struggle to run it with sort of a more free and an ad hoc network of individuals, right? For that one, you do need dedicated support, dedicated SOC, security teams. Who's going to wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning, right, when shit goes down, right? Like it's very important that you then have, right, a team, which kind of takes me to the labels, right? Because you need a very effective way, any very visual way, to tell the difference between the different setups. And I think there's actually, sorry, go on.
I really like this thing you've got on the screen that labels something from a data practices perspective in quite a simple way. I think that's great. I do worry about such things, such maturity models, such labels being applied at the right level.
Yes.
I think, so one of the things separately, discussions I have a lot about AI safety, AI explainability, AI quality. And there's a lot of people that would like to see ethical principles baked into sort of a labeling system like this. Mm-hmm. And one of the big debates there is that actually the technical principles underlying are quite immature. So I think if you do things at the wrong level and try and focus a little bit too philosophically on how you label things, I think they can give a very false sense of security.
Yeah.
I think also the trade-offs have to be considered very carefully, because if you have there's a lot of trade-offs in the contact tracing exposure notification world, and expressing those trade-offs in such a simple diagram might be hard. Maybe it won't be. And the other thing is, I think you have to be really careful to do is not envisage a specific implementation. I've seen some of these things and some guidance and things like that thinks about things in a very narrow way, in terms of one way you could approach the problem without considering other ways you could technically achieve the same goal. So I think it would be great if we could get to a labeling structure. I worry it's too early in the evolution of the whole domain.
So, and by the way, I was just trying to find out, because I saw a document that these guys published that actually had those definitions, right? And I think the key thing there is that problem, everything you said is actually spot on, right? Every one of those problems exists, right? The way I look at this is, do you want to be on the receiving end of it, or do you want to be the one that helps to define the standard? It's literally, it is that simple, right? So yeah. The opportunity here is that we get to define the rules of engagement, right? We get to define how we measure that. So the reason why I like this here, and I actually think that you know, what you were one of the Worldly Map sessions, right? Oh yeah, because we did that one, right? I actually think a Worldly Map is a better version. Like this is not one-off, right? I think it's very important to see that this is just something that this guy's made up, right? Like the main thing I get from here is the box, is the names here, you know, like the fact that you got a bunch of stuff, the fact that you identify 4 things that we believe are very important, and the fact that they actually, you know, are realistically looking at the detail, right? Oh, here we go. I think, oh no, it's not, there's a document that the guys actually published somewhere so there's a document that goes into the detail of every one of these and why they call it like that. Because the reality is that there is an ethical element to this. And that's one of the things I want to capture. Like you can't run away from it, right? The reality is that when you have a privacy first design, you are putting privacy and ethics and doing the right thing for the individual at the heart of what you design, right? That's no way around it, right? And I think what we want is to have an objective, fact-based way to approach it, right? And this is where, look, you know, I've done this in security. Right? Look, we once have a massive, interesting, you know, back and forth with our DPL. You guys, you know, DPL, right? The data privacy, you know, officer, right? Where we want to get a very clear definition of what was a breach, right? And initially, you know, the person kept evading the conversation, go, well, we can't do it, it depends. So we kept going with use case after use case going, is this a breach? Is this a breach? Is this a breach, right? You know, 10 cases later, we knew exactly what was a breach, right? It's uncomfortable reading because you're basically saying, we don't consider a breach when this amount of records are exposed. Those amount of records are a breach, but that's not. And we have data to support it, right? So it's very important that even when it's fuzzy, there's always a rule, right? There's always a judgment. And maybe sometimes the judgment is we can't make a judgment, and that's fine, right? That's still a valid option. But if you look at these cases, and that's kind of the thing I want to capture here, is I think if we can come up with 7 or 8 or 10 or 20 things that we can measure, right, that, you know, immediately are hitting privacy, immediately are hitting, you know, hitting ethics, immediately are hitting, you know, some of those hard kind of, you know, questions that you ask. I think at least the good news is we get to define the rules of engagement. So I think the challenge for you and for us is to come up with a model that when we look at it, we're going, well, you know, it addresses those concerns. And then we can get it peer reviewed, right? So the beauty of our community, if you think about it, is that because it's open, you know, you'll have access from human rights lawyers to privacy experts, to security researchers, to businesses, to vendors, to government agencies, like literally, it's like the community of the summit, right? You have access to all these players. And if you can get them all to agree, you know, on 10 or 15 of those, then that is a massive step forward.
Yeah, so obviously our view of what those things are is in the Git repo that I've had up in the last session. And for instance, we're focusing on consent from a privacy perspective. Everything is driven by user consent. But you may take a view that a government may take a view that for public health reasons, consent isn't the right approach, and they're going to mandate it in the public interest because there's a public health emergency.
Yeah.
And what I worry about is not coming up with my view, but it's coming up with a view that would necessarily translate to every scenario for contact tracing and exposure notification, every situation, and making those binary judgments. And that I just worry about that being hard to generalize.
That's why you have to tackle on, because the reality, and that's why I like the maturity, and that's why I like the labels, right? So if you think about it, the beauty of a label is that you get to tackle on, for example, those variations, right? So you get to tackle on to say, look, you know, there's 4 options on consent, right? You know. So by the way, I just shared this. This is kind of a document that we can use to put here. So let's start with that one, right? So if you look at consent, right, and you know, right, levels, right? So we can start to map it, right? So you can have, you know. So what would be, like, even what you just described, right? What will be the multiple options that you have, right?
Okay, well, option 1 is no consent.
Yeah.
Option 2 is a form of legal consent, where there's some kind of consent in an end user licensing agreement or terms and conditions document that's hard to get to.
Yeah.
I'd say level 3 is explicit informed consent.
Yeah. Informed consent, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is very interesting because there is some really good already precedent with GDPR, right? Because if you know, GDPR has some really good wording, which I still don't think has been fully explored, which is the fact that they went into saying, you know, if you create some insane consent, you know, legalese kind of, you know, freaking workflow, that is not acceptable because the user doesn't understand what the hell that means. Right?
Yeah.
So I really like that, explicit. And in fact, it's almost actually, you know, this, right? Because I think they're different, right? Or maybe
they are, yeah.
So there's a couple of things. Sorry, go on.
I just got 2 more.
Yeah.
The next one is the ability to permanently withdraw consent.
Withdraw, right?
Withdraw, yeah. And the next one is the ability to temporarily withdraw consent.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. And actually, sorry, for the other, you know, the ones on the call, please join in, right? Like, this is not a big crowd, right? You know, this is a good example of the sessions that we have at the summit, where sometimes it's a group of 5 or 7 or 8 or 10 that actually create, you know, something that lasts the summit, right? I think this is a good example of one of those sessions, right? So, you know, for the other ones on the call, please, you know, chip in with your views.
Hi, Dinis. I'm happy to. Just for those here, Dinis suggested I attend because we were talking about labels to try and find some core standardization around security and privacy more generally. And I'm very interested in that, finding easier ways to have a less is more win for this kind of stuff that helps people. But on that, just very specifically on that consent, the 5 and 6 items kind of belong on a different list, because if you can't withdraw consent, it's not consent. It's not legal. So
in Europe,
you are absolutely correct to call that out. Yes, from an EU data protection law point of view, which is my specialism.
Yeah. See, I would actually, I would agree with Sarah on this one. I feel that these are almost capabilities and properties of the application, which will, which will actually not just be relevant for consent. They might be, you know, if you think about it, you know, I might want to temporarily withdraw my data, right? I might want to temporarily withdraw the collection of data, right? So this will actually have a lot of, and this is why I think of this as a graph. So things are connected to each other. So, and I think, Adam, you know, I feel that sometimes at the moment, I still think that in your head, you're still thinking very binary, right? You know, you do this, you do that, you do this. I actually think that this is one of those, that there's multiple levels of what you need to do. And actually one of them is just capturing reality, right? You know, this is how I handle incidents, right? You know, first of all, I want to make sure I have a great base of facts, and then I can do analysis. Then I can do risk stuff on top. Then I can make an informed decision at the top. But without a base of facts, you know, I'm just guessing. And that's kind of what I think is important here, is that, you know, you have, and the first layer of labels is almost just facts, right? The point of a fact is that you should be able to prove it, right? You know, there should be a test case for the fact. Right?
Yeah, I agree.
And that's the, so if we take, but so can you see, like, so here, right? Just even on that simple example, you know, you could see that there's already a very different, you know, privacy setting, right? That you get with level 1, with level 4, just out of the bat.
So I'm not totally clear what no consent means and whether there's another level above that, because you've got scenarios where there's like an app that's mandatory. You could have an app that's mandatory and you have to carry your phone with you, and the police can stop you and check that you've got your phone with you. or there's an app that's optional to install, but just doesn't do much in the way of clarifying what you're consenting to at the point you install it, which I think is kind of what one was covering.
Yeah.
Like one doesn't cover, I don't think, state mandate, the state mandating the installation of the app and the carrying the phone with you.
But would that be then this, where an installation requirement, right? Where you almost have level 1, mandatory, right?
Yes, public interest lawful basis in GDPR terms, if that helps.
Yeah. So you got mandatory, enforced, right? Is what you're saying. Then you got, so this is the one where, the government says, or the agency says, or the company say. Remember that, as this hit the private sector, right? There's a lot of very fuzzy lines that will exist here, right? You could totally have a company that say, hey, everybody that works here has to run this app. Bottom line, right? If you don't do it, you get fired, right?
Which they can't do.
Well, you say that.
In
right?
the UK, again, under data protection law. They can rely on other legal instruments that they refer out to. So there may be. But
remember that this is supposed to hit worldwide, right? So, so you got mandatory enforced. You have mandatory not enforced, right?
So did you just say that an employer can't force people to install a location tracking app?
Yes.
What about, how does Uber and Deliveroo get around that?
Well, that's actually subject to legal challenge at the moment in a lot of areas. From an EU perspective, it's lawful basis and is woolly, and there are ways that you can get around it. But it's really reverts back to the fairness and reasonableness of it, and whether enforcers like the ICO are willing to chase people down for it. I'm not an extremist in this, but we can if we want to get into the minutiae of the various legal requirements you could lean upon if you're not caught versus reasonably lean upon, that's kind of where the grey areas lie.
Yeah, but
So I've read some concerns as well about, what's legal and not legal doesn't matter that much. If a company does it, even if it's illegal, then, you may not be able to bring a challenge to that, etc., in the time that it takes them to, effectively lose your job and suffer the consequences, or indeed just decide that you can't bear that risk and therefore you're going to accept it and install the app. So the fact that it's legal, may not deliver people kind of instant protection from these things, even if it does in the long run.
Yeah.
But there's a sort of, I guess the reason I saw this intertwined with the consent is, maybe it's just that some of these combinations don't really make much sense. So it doesn't really make sense to mandate an app and then give people the options as to whether to enable any of the individual features of it, for example. But maybe you could complete it
if you look at it, right, that we had lockdown, but a bunch of lockdown stuff was not enforced, right? It was like you rely on the population to do the right thing, right? For example, in France, you actually had literally a lot more enforcement than you had in the UK. Like, I think in France, you had to get some paper that you go to the website to tell why you're going out.
I've lost your connection, so I don't know.
Oh, sorry. Hello? Can you hear me, or?
I can hear you.
Yeah. I think that we lost Dermot.
So there's another side to this, which is you might consent to installation. In fact, it might not be installation really, because I can envisage a technical implementation in my extreme imagination where there's no app required to be installed. It's somehow done by a telco. Yeah. So it isn't installation as the start of collection of data, but there's a secondary aspect, which is disclosure of data. And that might be consented to at the same time. It might be consented to at the point of sharing a data with a government body, or it might be done once and then the data is shared constantly in a centralized implementation. So I think this is coming back to, let's not envisage too much what the implementation might be, because the technology may be very different in 6 months.
Yeah, but this is where I think it's very important that we focus laser sharp on what you guys do. It's like a threat model, right? Because or else this can just go massive, right? Like this, and this, I think is important to create something that, first of all, that we have good data on what you do, you don't do, but also that, it doesn't go far too wide. You know, like for example, like, you know, we can do this first version without the GPS part, so without the Bluetooth part, right? We, you know, it's only like, let's just look at the current tracing app with the features that it has.
Okay, so you just want to look at what we're doing. You don't want to consider other approaches.
Well, I think you already, you know, I think it's important. Well, you can consider other approaches to the point of view that, look, you do, like, you're doing informed consent, right? But you need to capture that the other options, right? So, you know, it's not just to do the stuff you do, but I think from a labeling property, right? I think if you're not careful, you're going to end up with 50 out of the bat, right? Where I think it's better to come up with a smaller list that is verifiable, so we can go to the next stage of this, which is, how do we verify this? How to do it? Like, it's better to have a label with 10 things or 15 things that you think about the meta-analysis on top of it, right? Then to have one that, you know, it goes too complex too fast. So it's almost like, you know, if you think about from a DevOps point of view, the end goal here is to have a label that you can present, that you can start to talk about it, that you can slap on it, that you can start to, you know, almost get that privacy, you know, meter level. Is this a privacy aware or not? You know, and where is it now, right? I think that's also very important, right? Where are you in, you know, in that kind of, you know, sort of, you know, gauge of privacy, you know, 100% private versus, you know, not, right? Where are you in that level? And to be fair, you already made a number of compromises, which is okay, right? Because, you know, like I think one of the guys said in one of the sessions, right? Fundamentally, this is a tracing application, right? So, you know, there's going to be a lot of compromises that you have to do just because of the type of app that this is.
Okay, yeah. In which case, this may be a good way for us to communicate compromises is through this kind of labeling structure.
And I would say that because you're already having a model that is designed for you to have a reference implementation and then tons of implementations out of it, I think it's very important that even you guys have a way to start identifying when either people shoot themselves in the foot or when they go and start deviating your principles.
Just something I don't know whether it will or won't help thinking, but what an approach that I've seen work really effectively is focusing on purposes. What are the use cases? What is the primary intended use case? And looking at the requirements for privacy or security for that use case, and then looking at other likely future or secondary use cases, and then reverting back to, are there capabilities in place to allow privacy and security by design and default relating to that core use case and reasonably likely secondary use cases? That may not help, or it may help, but that's certainly, if I'm going to approach assessment, that's how I would come at it.
You mean use cases for
Interesting.
Well, it all hangs off the purpose. It all hangs off what is the intent of what you are doing. What are you going to do with the data? If your intent is to try and mitigate the risks of an unchecked public pandemic, then you've got all kinds of lawful ways to tolerate a hell of a lot more risk than if your intent is to capture a lot of movement data to look at people's productivity in the workplace ongoing.
Well, and actually, you know, and Sarah just absolutely went to another place, which is, again, if you're not careful, what you guys creating is an employee tracking application, right? Which a lot of companies would love to have. And remember that there's a lot of security vulnerabilities, right? And there's a lot of security exploits, and there's a lot of security, I would say, you know, not ethical activities that started with benign intentions, right? It's like, you know, in fact, unfortunately, the information security in our field, there's a sad track record of a lot of things developed from the good guys that then get twisted, right, by a lot of other agents, right, agencies, right, or players that, you know, didn't respect the ethos of the first one. Right. So, and that's why I think that you need to game this to make it really hard for that to occur. Right. But Sarah, when you talk about use cases, are you talking about the use case of the app or the use case of the labels?
I was talking about use case of whatever we're labeling. And my terminology might not be helpful in a software dev perspective. Purposes was the terminology I would usually use. What is the purpose of the thing we're assessing? What is it trying to do?
Yeah, I actually think that's a very valid point, because the reality is that, yes, depending on the use case of the app, in fact, probably depend on the status of the app being used, or the status of the infection, the use cases will be different, and the privacy tolerance might be different.
Yeah, that's right. But I think it is also useful to think about nefarious purposes that other people might try and do.
Yeah, because what's a normal use case at the moment, right? Is the whole tracking and tracing, right?
Yes, it's as an undiagnosed patient, I want to record my location so I can remember it if I become infected. And as the diagnosed patient, I want to be able to recall that location so that I can then work with a contact tracer. Those are the primary use cases.
So if I said this, right? Right, which is a reality, right? So at the moment, for example, the way you describe it, right? You have a situation under control, right? You have reasonably under control. The system is not overwhelmed. And so I just muted Sarah for a little bit because I think she was not talking to us. Unmute yourself when you come back, Sarah. So, but I think it's important to understand that when either you got the hospitals, right, under stress, right, like the whole flattening of the curve, right, and when you have, basically the tracing team, right, under stress, this is a big risk that I think you need to take into account. Because these are two threat agents that will change the privacy settings. And there's an ethical element to this, right? There's an ethical element, I would argue, that when this is happening, you might want to overshare data, right? You might want to say, look, we can't do the tracking, right? We can't do the trace team, right? We can't do this because we don't have a trace team.
Yeah, the redaction is a good example of this, right? So we look at the contact tracer to redact home addresses and work addresses that aren't relevant. If you imagine a situation out of control, there aren't enough contact tracers, there's data coming in, there's no time to do that interview. You wonder if could a contact tracer just start hitting OK and publishing everything without actually bothering to do the interview and the redaction process.
Yes. And you see, and this is why it's important, right? It's like, this is where you do planning, right? You don't wait for that to happen, you plan for it, right? And that's why I think that, and always take into account that the hardest thing in privacy is not to take it away, is to bring it back, right? So you have a mode where if you accept that, you're going to run this at privacy level 3 or privacy level 1, because you have to, get some data, you have to make some decisions. You want to make it so that you can revisit a week later or 2 weeks later and bring back the dial. And if you don't do that, sorry?
Can we add COVID to the first 2 lines here?
Yeah.
I think that's important.
Yeah.
Because another sort of possible, okay, not COVID-20, just COVID-19.
Because we're going to have another new case, right? Because we already have.
I don't know. Who knows when the next one will be? But what I think part of the model is, people might be interested in this for seasonal flu, for example. And at the moment, our view is that's a different set of considerations that needs to be thought through differently. Rather, this has been built for COVID-19, and it's not just for tracking whatever your favorite infectious disease is this week. It is a COVID-19 app, and that's what we're thinking about, and it shouldn't be taken for granted that it's suitable for any other any other infectious disease.
But you will. This is where maybe I'm a little bit more realistic. Once this app is working, you will lose control of the use cases. The only thing you control is the main users, right? And you control a little bit the rules of the game that are being played.
Yeah, sure. But this is where we're talking about labeling, etc. Somebody, and using our brand in order to help support people that what they're doing is correct, etc. At the moment, there would be no as I understand it, no desire to give the PathCheck brand to somebody who wants to use this to track seasonal flu.
Yeah, that's a great point. So what you're basically saying is this, right? What about this? Right? So one use case, right, is non-COVID-19 use cases.
Well, I'd prefer to say other infectious diseases, because non-COVID-19 is just a little bit too broad an umbrella.
Okay. Well, but there's also,
I'm saying there's other non-infectious disease cases as well, but I think there's a kind of cluster to consider of other infectious diseases, and then there's, well, who knows? There's national security use cases and immigration use cases and all sorts of things that government authorities may wish to do in terms of when they might want to track or trace people.
Yeah. But that it's almost that so in a way you can say there's non-infectious disease use cases, which maybe you can say that's just borderline, kind of accepted, and non-COVID use cases, which is the one you described right now, which you might want to say, this app should not be used for that.
The way you've written them, I'd put that the other way around, but
what do you mean?
There's non-COVID infectious disease use cases, and there's non.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, like that.
Yeah, or non-health use cases. Let's say for the last one.
Okay, fine. Yeah, cool. And like so if you think about it, right? Just here is another one, level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? And when you put a label, right, for this, you almost want, this is green, that is red, right? A label straight away on what is the use case of that, right? It already falls into that, hey, this app was not designed for that. Because there's another level of analysis that you can do on these data. And what you're doing is you're priming the discussion, you're defining the rules of engagement of this app.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you got, okay, so the next one is adverse impact on reputational location business. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I added that. So we talked about this in one of the threat modeling sessions. We can see someone wanting to use the app to provide false data and falsely provide the location points of concern and falsely say they were infected. And we can see if someone did that with multiple devices or multiple people, they could create the perception of a particular location or a business at a particular location as being a hotspot for COVID-19 when it in fact wasn't.
Yeah, so but I think but there you're talking about an abuse case,
yes,
right? Not the actual use case of the app. All right, we would not design an app to have an adverse impact on reputation of location business.
But aren't some of these abuse cases? Some of these other ones?
No,
so non-health use case?
I was thinking of this as actually the way the health authority or the authority using the app is actually using it for.
Okay, we can remove it. The other one,
no, I think you need to keep it. But I think you need to keep it because we're not here.
Okay.
I think what that is also something like this, or and I think this is very important, right?
Yeah. So I think if you look at something like the use of this data by the police department, say, there's two different models. One is the police department take the repo and they fork it and they use it and they kind of launch some Safer Communities initiative and do a whole bunch of marketing around that. That's one model, and that pushes into the sort of unintended use cases. And then the other would be that the police department hack into the health department's computers and look at their data and use that to help their policing. And that's more in the sort of abuse case, even though it's kind of achieving the same goal, but one is by a deliberate deployment, albeit one not aligned with our original goals, and the other's a abuse of a established deployment. And I think they make sense to think of those as two separate categories. And
what you just talk about is, for example, this, right? And by the way, they wouldn't hack it, right? They would just get
subpoena, whatever. Yeah,
they'll get a legal thing to get that, right? But I feel that is actually a really, I would say absolutely massive design principle that you have to have, which is
Mhm.
your threats won't just come from external entities, right? Your threats will come from within the system. And that's why when you talk about data minimization, right, is almost preventing those assets from existing, right? Like my experience on this, especially dealing with lots of data lakes, is that as soon as you create an asset, there's always going to be a business case for it. And it doesn't matter how much the first version of that asset is created by saying, you're not supposed to touch it. It's only here. It's only for this one use case. We only need it for this. We only need that for billing customers, etc. The moment there is a database in a table in your data lake that has information, that has business value, there will be a business case to access it. So actually, the easiest way to deal with that is not to have the data in the first place, right? Which is kind of why when I saw that massive pool of raw information, patients' data, my kind of, spider sense go, ooh, that's exactly what I would go for, right? Even from a legal point of view, right? So if you think about it, in that particular example, the police force or other forces might go, well, we need that data where it is. Oh, look, there it is, right? The data is right there. Can I just get a hook from it, right? And I think it's important to have a design that minimizes that. And that the moment that changes, something changes. And this is the same thing that my approach to risk, right? I always view that it's the business, is the executives, is the board decision to accept whatever risk they want, because that's, their job. Our job is to make sure that it's a conscious decision. In this case, the public has also the right to know what's going on. So I would argue that it's okay for an entity to, throw a massive, hole onto all of these. What you want is to make sure that when that happens, right, it's public and is accountable. And if it has to happen because of something like this, it should be reversible as soon as possible. Or else you get the diminishing returns, right? Where you keep eroding the app until you end up with a very complete design or usage.
Yeah, so I don't know where it should be in which category, but having a decommissioning plan is a, I don't know if it belongs on any of these slides yet, but what?
No, I think that's very important. Data decommissioning, right? Is that decommissioning plan for?
Like, what are the circumstances under which we will, take this off the app store, delete the data, whatever else?
Well, I think you need two, right? Or almost.
You probably need stop collecting data. You need delete data. There may be other things, but there's a broad category of decommissioning in general.
Yeah, and you talked about beacons and other infrastructure created to enable this. Would that come under that umbrella or again, or is
I think
that
it's another category to consider? Yeah, when do you remove those?
Or is it just once it's in, it's the ratchet effect, it's there and it stays?
Yeah. Well, for example, you guys were saying that the decommission plan for data, for example, is every 2 weeks, right? Or something like that, right? Or 2 weeks, So actually,
yes, but if you're looking at this more broadly, people who don't have a rapid deletion of data might have a horizon on when they are going to just delete all the data. The NHS is deleting all in 20 years' time, I think. They committed.
Yeah.
Because I think it's different, right? You got the same thing, right? You got, you almost got this, right? You got, because there's decommission plan for app, decommission plan for data, right? And which is, this is important, right? Again, in real world stuff, so nice and good to have a disaster recovery plan. When was the last time they actually tested? In fact, we did that, 3 months ago, right? We actually tested out all our, disaster recovery plans, because suddenly the whole theory of what happens if the office was not available, it's like became a reality, right? Yeah, so I think
retention and retraction of data, I think, deserves its own slide.
Yeah, because you're getting into anonymization, pseudonymization, and remaining personal as well, which have different requirements, and metadata versus content.
Yeah,
I'd actually say anonymization also needs a slide on its own.
Yes, absolutely. So let's just capture that, right? So you got data retention. So data retention in your case is 2 weeks, right? Actually, wait, forever, right?
Well, there's two angles here. There's how long is the data of undiagnosed patients retained on their phones, and how long is data of diagnosed patients retained by the healthcare authority?
Yep. Yeah, I agree. I think that's actually great. That's a really good one. And actually, look, if you look at that, and this is sort of kind of where I want to go with this, right? You know, this is where it gets interesting, right? Because, you know, what you got is this, right? Mobile phone, what's it called? Health authority, right? So what we now can do is we can now map out the multiple, you know, players that exist here, right? Anonymized data, right? So these are the, I'm just trying to capture, you know, please let me know I'm missing another major one, right? What are the other places where data exists, right? Actually, where the other one I know that you already mentioned is data lakes, right? Which is the people that get a feed, you know, feed from data, right? Or maybe this, data exports. So remember when we talk about that, you know, some of the health authorities might take data feeds and connect from the data that you have, that data will exist too, somewhere else. So
Yes,
in your model,
although in our model, that's binary. There is some kind of data lake and reporting functionality, or there is not. And to the degree that we can control it, there is not.
yeah, but I guess so. So in this case, right, will be so you can capture that, you know, in these case questions that are not in scope, right?
Yeah.
But you can you see how important it is to, even when, you know, the answer is we're not looking at it, that now you captured it. Because when I look at this, without, for example, this last one, we can have one where, oh, the data eventually gets entirely deleted. But it's very important that when we talk about data retention, we capture every single flow that the data that you capture lands on, right? Which is why I actually think that there's an element here that you almost want to say you shouldn't allow a lot of this to happen, or you should prevent this from happening, because it's a set of data that you don't control.
And going back to what Dermot was saying a bit earlier about how we are looking at a SaaS solution, one of the benefits of that is we could control and prevent that kind of thing much more easily.
Yes, absolutely. And this is where you could see that the label, right? In fact, look, here you go, right? So the label that, right? So the label for the SaaS platform will be different from the label from another company. And in fact, look, you can have somebody that creates a more secure version of it, right? There could be somebody who say, hey, I'm going to compete on the secure handling, right, of this data. And they may be able to invest more in security, more in actually create something that from a label point of view, and then you remember that you can now game this situation, right? You can say, look, you guys can go more strict, but here are the rules of the game. And if you check all these boxes, then yeah, look, you deserve to have, you know, a higher, you know, score than even your own SaaS, right?
Yeah, agreed.
Let me be clear, right? If somebody like, for example, Google decides, or GitHub, right, decides to host one of these, they will have more resources, more security, more infrastructure to do a better job than you guys have, at least, you know, in the short term, right? Just because, you know, if you look at their security architecture and their security capabilities, is higher, right? Now, I'm not sure they're going to do it, but again, it's an interesting game, right? Just to promote the existence of that ecosystem that actually can provide even more restrictive, more aggressive privacy kind of, you know, settings, and then you can allow the market to compete on that, right? So okay, let's look at this, right? So the data retention at the moment on a mobile phone is what? Is the app install lifecycle, right?
That's, I guess, level one, right? Level two is that it's set to something based on research about infection. So something like 14 days.
Yeah. Okay. Is that okay? So that's time-based, right? For example, 14 days.
We assume that data is always deleted when an app is deleted? Or is there a scenario in which the app can be deleted and the data left behind?
Depends how you do the app. So one of the use cases that you guys have to do on your testing app is to make sure that, so you need to look at the app to app attack, right? You need to look at the rootkit the device to app attack, which sometimes, you don't have a lot to do, but it's important to understand, right? How that flows. And then you have to look at the app to, when the app gets installed or when the app gets removed, right? What's left behind. And well, I don't think you guys doing that, but I've seen cases where, there's shared environments, share things, share
SD cards,
SD cards or pictures or things that you can leak, right? So there could be data leaks occur. Although usually that gets covered with the app to app, right? Because what gets left behind by definition means any app can access it.
This was the first OWASP test I did, by the way, in the mobile suite.
So I guess my point is, isn't there a something that's worse or more? More severe from a data retention point of view. I'm not sure which order these are going in. I think app installed lifecycle was supposed to be the sort of weakest level.
Yeah,
you're right. There's a weaker level, which is device lifecycle, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yes.
Yep.
Even then, it might persist in a Google Cloud account or something forever.
Well, that's the other thing I was going to ask, right? So one thing that is interesting here, when you look at the mobile phone, right? I think one option here is cloud storage, right? Because if the data is now stored, like you said, on a cloud, right? Where does it go? And this might be a separate property in itself, right? So some of these might be one of those, if you're not using cloud storage, we don't care about it. But if you do use cloud storage, then we care about it, right?
Yeah, or if you don't explicitly set in the Android manifest that you don't want Google backup to pick up all the data and back it up for you, then that data you're collecting has been shared with Google, even in an encrypted form.
That's actually a very good point, right? Because you can even have just that already.
I assume we've done that, Adam.
Yep,
have we
checked that on Android at least.
Yeah.
But remember that you're also playing, a long game, right? My experience is that most security vulnerabilities were not there in the beginning design, right? Most security vulnerabilities were introduced when a feature came along that required a small change into the design that changed the pattern. And because you didn't have a threat model in front of you, it was easy to make that change because the cost at the time was more of how long is it going to take to implement this feature versus this is fundamentally changing one of our design patterns. Right, which is why this is so critical, because you have to think that you're not just locking it today, you're locking your design for the next 6 months to 6 years or a decade, right? So you're preventing almost your next generation, right, of developers and maintainers to actually do things that, from your point of view, that break some of your design principles, right? All right, cool. So so you got storage backups, or actually you can also have explicit storage, right?
Can I just say I'm really loving this, because as somebody who's a consumer and someone who does assurance and sometimes a purchaser of this stuff, having something that tells me what the capabilities are, that actually shows me the use cases in which they're relevant, and also gives me configuration where it's my configuration that impacts the risk, that's a godsend. That really is a godsend. That would be a competitive advantage. That would be a differentiator for me.
And I think what's nice about this app is that in a way they already done all the hard work, right? And they already said they're privacy first. It's much harder to have these conversations where usually by now this would start to be shut down in flames because the other player will realize that they couldn't play the game properly, right? So I think the nice thing of this app is you guys can play this very effectively, right? Because you already done the hard part, right? You already open sourced. Like you already made that commitment, you already go privacy first. That's usually where the deal breakers occur, right? So I think we need to leverage this, right? But Sarah, I think you're right. This kind of data would allow a lot of informed decisions, and it's something that it can be made to be understandable, right? Eventually we want to get like a rating, a 1 to 5, 1 to 10, right? You want to get, or maybe 4 elements that you got, like it's kind of like with a health label, where you get, the sugar, the this to that. We want eventually that top level but all of that should be backed up by data. So when somebody said this app is, level 2 on privacy versus the other one to level 5, we have to be able to say, well, because you don't do this, 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 and this, right? Cool. All right. So if we look at this, you got time-based, app install, device install, backups, explicit usage of cloud storage, right? Which actually, this is almost usage. Yeah. So we need to think about, this is almost like deletion, right? So you need to check if it's deleted, right? Something like that. Right. And again, because you could delete the data from here, but not delete from there, right?
Yeah, well, the approach we've taken is to block Google backup from taking backups of the data.
Yeah.
So I don't know if the users can explicitly, I'm sure a user can. Yeah, a user can do a backup in another way with the USB cable or whatever.
But it's interesting because even on that one, you create a usability problem, right? That means that if I move to another mobile phone, I lose my tracking data.
Yeah, that's right.
And you can see your story, which basically says, as a user, when I move to another mobile device, I want to keep my tracking data, which belongs to me, right?
I was kind of sort of thinking about that a little bit. Is the other interesting thing for this is the user that has multiple mobile phones at the same time.
Yes.
I don't know how that's going to work.
Well, I can envisage a scenario where one of those phones is declared infected and the other isn't, and the user gets a notification on the other phone. I'd imagine, with a
That'd be quite funny.
with a GPS-based scenario, I can imagine that someone would install it on 2 phones, and I would imagine they would have to just do the same actions on both phones to share their data. How a contact tracer would deal with that, I don't know. They'd potentially either publish 2 aggregated records. We haven't thought about that too much.
Because I think of it, I think of it as a consumer type of product. It may be. I mean, I think of some of the things that I've done as a consumer past is I had one work for phone, one for private. And if I'm a user, I'd like to be able to kind of switch it, just tracking me, and switch between individual phones, which is a slightly different problem. It's more of a technical problem and a design problem than a sort of like a security or a data retention problem. But
yeah. Just in terms of that time-based retention stuff you just wrote, I don't particularly like that. I think it the level 1 is kind of, there is no retention policy, if you like. There is no retention information available about what the healthcare authority does. I think the level 2 is that in the app, you're told what the retention level of the retention period of the health authority is when you disclose the data to them. And I think level 3 is probably that is technically enforced end to end. So the NHS can't tell us it's 14 days and keep the data 20 years. You're on mute, Dennis.
Sorry, I don't have it there. Yeah. So I think you're describing, right? Almost like a policy there. So what was it? Was you got
So the first one is it's not known.
Yeah.
The second one is in the app you are displayed the policy of the healthcare authority. And the third one is that policy is technically enforced end to end.
Well, yeah, but this is almost, right? I almost view that that's a different part, right? If you look at that, right? Because, you know, take into account the multiple scenarios, right? So you go, so you actually have this, right? Is, you know, what's it called? Is not enforced. Because you actually have this, right? So I think that's a little bit different. Because you can have an app display that is not enforced, right?
I suppose a legal privacy policy, rephrase, a privacy policy is of legal reference and can be enforced, whereas what I mean is enforcing it with technical measures. Yeah,
no, I think that's technically enforced, right? Because, you know, and this goes back to actually the point I think Dermot made, right? You know, it's so nice and good for somebody to say I have a policy. The second part is, are you actually enforcing it? And we have a way to check it, right? And in fact, I would even try to add here, you know, something like independently verified, right?
Yeah, independent oversight.
Yes.
Although that's potentially an entire other broader category about, you know, is the contact tracing program, is there a suitable independent oversight board? So that independent oversight might come up on a whole bunch of different threads here.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'd also suggest separating technically and legally enforced as well, because referring to lawyers for contract or policy breach is a totally different world to actually legally, technically making it impossible not to comply.
Yeah. And the thing about this, right, like, you know, what I also like from a security point of view is you start to game the system not to have access, not to have data, right? So here's an example, right? So, you know, the health authority, so this is what I was thinking about, the retention, right? You know, there is a model where they don't have any data, right? Right? There's a model where the data lasts hours, days, weeks, years, or forever.
Yeah.
So remember that model when we were talking about where you encrypt the data, right, on the device, and only the health authority client, right? Oh, sorry, only the tracer, you know, browser is able to decrypt it, right? So there's a model. I would say the health authority, at least from a storage point of view, doesn't have the data. The data doesn't exist there. And if you then even move to the point where, in some cases, you know, the person can actually redact on their own phone, then it might be a case where the sensitive data does never really reach, or at least a chunk of the sensitive data never really reach the health authority.
Yeah, so there's another dimension here, which is what data they have, which goes all the way from at one extreme, they have all data about everybody, to all data about infected patients, to redacted data about infected patients, to redacted anonymized data about infected patients.
And actually, I just had an idea, like, given the fact that some of these devices do have a lot of computational power, you might want to look, not now, but there's a possible scenario where you can even anonymize the data on the phone. Right? So you can have a situation where the only data that leaves the phone is actually anonymized data. And actually, that's a cool one, because remember now we're talking about those multiple use cases, right? So if you look at, you know, types of data that you have, remember that, you know, I think the ones when I was kind of calling it, you know, data, I don't know for now, because you had those three types, which was the AIL, right, which is anonymized location, right? Anonymized location information. So you got this, then you have the, what was it?
You said filtered paths, FLPs.
Yeah. So was it that? So you got the raw location paths, right? And you got the filtered. Yeah. Was it? No.
That's what you had, yeah.
Yeah. I don't think it was FLP, it was something else, was it?
I think so. I think that the key thing is they move from paths to information at the point that they're anonymized, because you lose the connections between the data points.
Yeah. So you can see here, right? Like from this is very toxic. This is dangerous, right? And this is safe.
I think you've got to be a bit cautious with using the term anonymized as well, a little bit, because, and again, I'm fixating on GDPR, because if it's anonymized, it's no longer subject to any privacy controls. Whereas I think what we're talking about here is reducing risks, or making risks negligible. Because if it's on your phone, it's by default linked to an individual, so it's not anonymous. It can't be anonymous.
Yeah, and I think you're right.
But what we're talking about isn't on your phone. So just to explain this a little bit. So when we take in data from patients, that data is then aggregated. Now, that isn't anonymization under the European Data Protection Board's view, but when sufficient a number of patients' location history is aggregated, it becomes significantly less personal, shall I say.
Yeah, differential privacy principles, and potentially adding noise later and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Sarah, if you look at the from a COVID app, you can find it. Can you see my screen? So if you go into this session we did of the Worldly Maps, there is a slide deck that I got here, which I just quickly walk you through it. And
I didn't do my homework. I'm sorry.
Oh, cool! You saw it. Oh, great. So yeah, so I think there's that. There you go. FIP and our REPAP. Yeah, sorry. So I think the interesting design pattern here is whether, and by the way, more and more I think we should call that pseudo-anonymized, right? Because I'll give an example, right? I went for dinner with a family, right? A couple, days ago. We spent the night, not the night, but we were there for dinner a long period of time, trying to keep the distance, blah, blah, blah. But the reality is that if we get an infection point on that day, right, and know exactly who was infected.
I think it's aggregated. I don't think it is. I don't think we should use the word anonymized. I prefer aggregated.
Yes, I agree with you. Right, but the interesting thing here, right? So I guess the design pattern I was hinting is that you could create that here. You could create that on the app itself.
How do you do the aggregation on the app?
Because you could provide data to the app. In fact, I was actually thinking, right? This data here, which is the current, what's it called? What do you call it? Aggregated, right? Infection location, could probably be used to calculate the next update to that. Because remember that we were talking about the idea that you want to limit the scope and the granularity based on how much data exists.
So you mean delegating the public, so you mean that the phone sends an end-to-end encrypted version of the data to the contact tracer. The contact tracer does some stuff with that and tells the phone what to publish, and then the phone aggregates with the publicly available data and publishes to the healthcare authority endpoint?
Yes.
Is that what you mean?
But I think you don't need to send, I think that data already exists, which is this one here.
Yeah.
Right? I think you're right. In fact, it's already on the phone, right?
Yeah, I like it. Decentralizing the aggregation. So
Yep.
it further reduces the amount of exposure within the healthcare authority.
And I think what you have there, infection patch. Yeah, so what you got is you can actually have, and that data can be calculated, right, on the mobile device. Now, the only thing here I think it's an interesting question is, and maybe just put a question mark here, right, which is aggregated does it justice? I don't think, because I can aggregate, the filtered paths, right? And the idea is that you are trying to pseudo-anonymize it, right? Maybe, anonymize is such a strong word, but you're trying to take, this data here, which is highly, tracked to an individual, and you try to make it safe. Because I could aggregate this data, right?
I think
Yeah.
the reason I don't like using anonymized is because you can argue for a long time about whether it's anonymized, and it means different things to different people. The HIPAA healthcare data guidance in the US is quite different to the European view of whether it's anonymized. So, I mean, I just prefer aggregated because it ultimately is just aggregated, filtered infection paths.
I think that's such a good point.
Sorry?
I mean,
Sorry,
But you could call it aggregated filtered to prevent it from to distinguish it from aggregated raw that you're proposing.
Yeah.
An observation on this, and I think we're falling into what Adam sort of expressed as a concern earlier about becoming quite implementation specific here, because we're focusing on the user data being location data, but that assumes a GPS based proximity detection. Whereas there's Bluetooth-based proximity detection, which can, again, there's user data with the specific IDs that have been assigned, and those can either be stored on the phones or they can be centralized. And there's a whole bunch of concerns there as well. So, and potentially there's other kind of sonar-based and other technology approaches to proximity detection. So,
yeah, but I think that's why, I to be fair, like I'm doing that by design, right? I think that if you go too wide, you start to going all sorts of rabbit holes, where I feel that even if you just have a label that is a little bit implementation specific to this version, that is already a complex enough exercise to do end to end.
It's okay. So sorry, this is for labeling of deployments of this app rather than labeling of contact tracing apps.
Well, I would start with this app and then we rate the others, right?
Start with, okay, right. But how do you draw a distinction? If you're going to rate a centralized Bluetooth app and a decentralized Bluetooth app, where do they come on your data score if this is the way that you've drawn up the scores?
Yeah, so yeah, sorry, I think that's a good point, right? So I think we need to add a couple of things that are more generic, right, which addresses other apps. But I think it's important that we make this work for the app that you have at hand, okay. And then we start to add the exceptions.
Okay, so this is fine. So this is a slide about types of location data, then, not types of data. And there are maybe other types of. You might need another slide for other types of data that might be used in contact tracing.
Yeah, you're right. Yes. So you basically, in fact, we types of collectors, right? Which is what you got here, right? You got GPS, Bluetooth, right?
Yeah.
Wi-Fi. What beacons, right? Something like that.
Well, beacons are either Bluetooth or Wi-Fi, but I guess there are.
You can have other types, right? Well, I guess that's the only ones that. Well, you're gonna have dedicated, location beacons, right?
Mm-hmm.
But would they be Bluetooth? Yeah, probably one of them.
Bluetooth, right? Or they'd be Wi-Fi typically.
Okay.
There's you can do sound-based, and there's some other experimental approaches.
What was that?
What do they call it?
You said sand.
Sound.
Oh, sound.
But I can't remember what the ultrasound they call it. It's ultrasound detection.
Yeah. But yeah, so I think, look, some of these you can capture, right? Generic, some of these will be more generic for different types of apps, right? But I think what's nice about what we're doing here is we're looking at actually the properties that you almost have for an app that the one you guys doing, because that's a real world app, right? Because the problem with privacy and security is always the details, right? If we don't address the details, you've got tons of blind spots on this thing, right? So it's important to have that level of granularity, which is why this thing hasn't been done a lot, right? But if you remember that, what you want is a labeling system or a standard that can be peer reviewed, can be verified, can be independently checked, and you have the kind of credibility that you want. Because remember that you guys today say you're privacy aware, but you don't have a way to pin that, right? Very strongly. And I think that, you know, this kind of labeling system would allow you to pin and say, this is exactly what we're doing. This is how we're thinking about this. This is where the compromises have been made. And also, you know, I go back to that point where you want to make sure that you can rate the implementations of your product. Because I think that's one of the biggest weaknesses of the model by design, right? It's not a weakness. It's just that the openness, you know, of your platform allows easy abuse in a way that the closeness of the platform would not allow that, right? Mm-hmm. And in fact, you know, I think I had one here, which is this, right? So there you go. So if you look at the source code, right, what you got is you got proprietary, code not available, code available to selected parties, right? Which is, you know, some of the apps. You've got open, you know, open code, right? Or code released, right? Code publicly available, which is still not open source, right? Because there's a lot of, you know, these days I've seen, you know, a lot of people confuse, you know, open source, right? With publicly available codes and that, right?
I don't think it's just the source code. It's also the documentation and the documentation of things like security, privacy risks, which are just as important to be transparent about.
Oh, I completely agree with that. Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's spot on, right? And actually, it's almost, you know, in that case, you almost, you know, you got these parts here, where it's almost governance, right?
Yeah.
Right? Closed, you know, small, I don't know. Sarah, this is where we need some of your wordings, right? And somebody with a bit more privacy and experience, right? And stuff like that, right? And actually, because what you want is almost foundation, right? That is what you want it to be, right? Right? Because ultimately, you want an independent foundation, right? That that allows you to verify, and it's, you know, there's an openness of governance. And I would just add the one you just mentioned. So I'm missing this a little bit, but I just want to capture this. Is the one you mentioned was also the security information, right? Because I think that right. is super important. Where, you know, if you look at, in fact, the security is almost one, you know, as big as its own, right? So so if you look at, here we go, others. If you look at the security properties, right? You got, you know, closed, you know, open, you know, and I think this is where we really, I think we need to kind of zoom on this one, because you guys have, you know, policies, public, and all that jazz, right? So it's almost, you want to capture security policies, security testing, right? All of that can follow this.
Yeah, and what I'd like to do in Europe, at least, is to have a data privacy impact assessment deliverable. I'm not sure we'll get there next week, but also we're not rolling out to Europe next week. But I think those kind of DPIAs that have been published in Australia as well as Europe, I think are the gold standard in terms of transparency. Although embedding PDFs within PDFs isn't a good way to achieve transparency like the UK did.
Don't get me started on that.
Yeah. But look, this is also where I think, and this is the reason why I want to do this before we talk about the OWASP stuff, is because I think there's a really good community of security professionals, right? Both from the risk point of view and the technical side, that we can now go and say, hey, can you pick one of these, right? Can you now help us to move that item to the right, or to get a checkbox, or what would it take to get a checkbox there, right? Because some of these probably deserve their own labeling system, right? And I think that's okay, right? You know, like I like the view that the more detail we have here eventually down the line, the more effective the thing will become, as long as it's a big graph and everything is connected, and we scale this. So there's a technological piece of work that, that's the one I'm personally interested in, which is how to create a graph out of this, how to make this scale. And by the way, my first instinct from a technical point of view is to do that using YAML files or JSON files. Now you use that to capture the metadata. So you put a lot of this information that you have here on a YAML file. So as you update that, right, then the labeling kind of changes itself based on that. And then eventually it becomes a case of introducing more resilience and security and change controls on that one. But the reality is that even if you have a simple YAML file on the GitHub repo, you immediately get change control, you get version control, you get a lot of interesting security properties that then allow you to verify and have a chain of authority on this.
Just a very small thing, Dinis, if you want to change that to data protection for the DPIA, because you're going to get a heck of a lot of pros who get very precious about them not being the same thing. The DPIA is very specifically a data protection thing, but yeah, absolutely, you can embed your security information under that.
This is this, right? Published data protection reports.
No, DPIA is a data protection impact assessment. It's a legally defined document to achieve a certain end, which is to understand end to end how you're meeting the compliance requirements.
But then we should have that, right? Or not?
And estimating risk. Yeah.
For
the EU, and it's probably the most transparent document anyone's publishing about anything right now that covers this kind of ground.
So I think the point is it shouldn't be under a security reporting heading. Is that right? It should be under privacy and security reporting. Would that do?
Yeah, probably data protection and security.
In fact,
privacy is what you're trying to defend.
In fact, that should be that, right? It's almost privacy reporting, right? Like that.
It can serve both purposes. You can put both if you like, because I think it can be the vehicle for security as well.
Yeah.
The thing that concerns folk is that if it's too security centric, you forget things like transparency and notification and lawful bases and things like that. And if it's too privacy focused, you can get a little bit of a pick and mix of very basic control coverage and not actually get into the detail you need.
We'll probably have to also have this, right? A nice Gdpr assessment, right? It's another kind of worms. But we should.
Is the DPIA not a GDPR assessment?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, the DPIA is your deep dive on that particular use case.
Yeah, but there's a lot more other things, right? That GDPR covers, right?
Yeah, the process that leads to you being able to publish a DPIA you could call it a data protection assessment, but that's the DPIA is the report that.
Yeah, that you publish on that particular use case. But if you look at, for example, some GDPR, we've done some assessments where we actually look at, the whole of the key parts of GDPR and look at, where are we doing with that one, right? On the actual GDPR item.
Yeah, you can do a full health check on an organization. You can do a gap analysis, and you can look at whether they've got all the components that enable any kind of due diligence across the piece for data.
Yeah.
And then, your DPIAs are a purpose or a group of purposes that is your focus.
Cool. All right, good. So I think that I have, this is exactly what I was trying to create for this session, right? Because that's one thing here. I want to add dangerous. Sorry. Safe. Dangerous. So does it make sense what I'm saying here?
Safer, maybe.
Safer, yes. This allows identification, right? So this is something that it allows. This is dramatically reduces, right? Almost like prevents or limits, right? Something
I think
like that,
in combination with appropriate filtering, it really limits it. Yeah.
Yeah, because so the point here would be location data is across a population, right? So this is population focus, right? Aggregated, right? So this is like aggregated population data, right? And this is individual path data, right? Isn't that correct? So the location data is where it aggregates everything, but the paths, the way we talk about here, right, is the actual where you've been and the actual, you know, I think I like to say, like, you know, if you give me 10 paths, right, where somebody was, I can tell you exactly, you know, the sequence of events of that person, right? Mm-hmm. Especially because his time is located with time.
I still disagree with you as a path once it's been filtered.
Well, but filtering, you're only removing some nodes from your path, right? Still a path.
But once it's been filtered, you don't know which nodes have been removed, and you don't know the path that someone took, right?
Depends how much data is there. Because what you're saying is a subset of the original path, but it's still a path. Where from the aggregation information, I don't know. So correct me if I'm wrong, right? So my understanding from your data sets that you have is when he's on that, even the filtered infection path, for an individual, I know that that person went here, 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 and here, right? When he's aggregated, I kind of know that there was infection points here and here and here, right? But it's now globalized, right? And you can tune out some of the timings, right?
So in its raw form, I can kind of get your point that if you know where someone was every 5 minutes, you can approximate where, you know, you can interpolate that, right? You can figure out the path they might have taken or most likely took. If you have a data point from 9 a.m. and a data point from 5 p.m., because everything in between has been redacted, I don't think you can imply any kind of path. They could have been to Heathrow and back from central London, right?
It depends what it is, right? I think the problem you have there, but you're right. I think that the filtered paths are, you know, less dangerous, but I still think they're dangerous, right? Because I think at the moment in time,
yeah, because what you do have is, it's not just, I know it was somebody who was at this restaurant at this time, but it's somebody was at this restaurant at this time, and at this newsagents at this time, and at this cafe at this time, and it's very, you only need 2 or 3 of those data points before it very quickly identifies down to a single person rather than one of a crowd.
Yeah, you're right. Because if you look at it and actually the expectation would be that, for example, like if you have, let's say, 10 individuals that are all infected, you know, when you look at the infection paths, you see where they went, right? But when you see the aggregated one, you just see the locations of all those 10 where they've been to, correct? So the correlation between a person that does something is much lower than what you've got, right? So here, like, you know, if it was me, you go that, oh, I got the supermarket, I got there, I got, you know, me playing football, you know, when we get back to do that, right? All that jazz, right? But, you know, when you do have the aggregated, you just see that in my area, there's 25 hotspots. So you don't get that correlation, which is why I think that a key element here is to increase the geographic circle, right? When you don't have a lot of data.
So there's one other thing that I don't know if we've got time to cover to give it justice, but I think is really important from a privacy perspective, if not a security perspective, which is the use of algorithms.
Yes.
I think there's a level, kind of a good use of algorithm, which is looking at points in time and space and determining whether they occurred close enough together based on research to be relevant. There's a more harmful level, which might be using machine learning to infer the likelihood of someone being infected based on their location and who they are, which I think is one of the things the NHS wanted to do with their centralized app to detect super spreaders.
So what was the first one?
First one was essentially comparing time and points in time and space based on medical research. The second one was using machine learning and location to determine the likelihood of infection. And the third one is using machine learning and personal data in addition to location to predict infection, which I think is very bad.
Yep.
But I'm not sure I've got time to go into that in 4 minutes. But
no, I think that's absolutely spot on. And in fact, the other one I would like to absolutely address is the actual understanding, right, of the algorithm, right? Where the where you go from, what's it called? Where you basically go from known, right, to known, understood, right? And then it's got to be based on, academic research, right, or something like that. Or
it's about being able to reverse engineer to the basis for the correlation.
Sorry, say that again.
Is this about being able to reverse engineer from the conclusions drawn to the basis for that?
Yes. So the logic is
explainability.
Yes, that's the word, isn't it?
Yeah. And there's another aspect to this, which is whether the algorithm has a direct legal and significant effect on people's rights. So if the algorithm says you are infected, are you immediately locked up somewhere in a detention center, or is a contact tracer just going to take that as a hint?
Well, it's almost like, what was my way to capture that? Consequences of ML decision? Something like that?
Consequences of an algorithmic decision.
Well, I think an exposure notification, should we say, or not? Because it's, yeah, well, maybe not. Maybe it's more general.
No, I think not just exposure notifications, not in the way the UK has been allegedly looking at it.
Well, is that fact where you have cases, for example, where the decision is final, right? Like there's some legal, I think, already situations where some machine learning is determined if you get bailed or if you do this or you do that, and literally, and that's final, right? Like you said, the decision is final, right?
Yeah, it's a prompt and efficient way to address exceptions that has human intervention.
Yeah,
that needs to be part of any such permitted analysis.
And the best is, I guess, it informs you and you only of something. It doesn't tell anyone else.
So is this kind of what we're thinking about? The consequences, final, absolute, human review, and advised mode.
Well, there's probably a difference between human challengeable and human reviewed. Like you could have 90% of them are machine generated, but you can at least challenge them if they're, which probably is. It probably goes about. I'd probably swap the ordering of those in terms of.
Okay. Yep. And this is where it gets interesting, right? Because somebody says, yeah, we can challenge, of course. And you go, do you understand actually how the rhythm goes? Like, where's the explainability status of that? And if you don't get like these 20 points or this very clear explanation of how the machine learning algorithm got to it, then we can say, look, it is final, right? Like, it doesn't matter, right? At the moment, nobody's able to challenge the freaking thing, right? So might as well assume that, it is at that level.
Is there also the explainability to the person who receives the information about the decision?
No, this is technical. That's what I'm thinking, right? This is a technical explainability, right?
Yeah.
Do you actually understand the algorithm?
Right, but there's also a difference between as a user. I mean, maybe this belongs on a different slide. As a user, I'm told you need to lock up because of some algorithm, and yes, we can assure you that our data scientists completely understand the algorithm, versus you need to lock up because you were in this place at this time and had this interaction.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Yeah. Because actually, even from a user trust point of view, which is actually interesting, because it might actually be that some users will prefer, will be comfortable with, a machine processing your data and giving you a result than a human do, right? There's that whole thing of, fundamentally people were kind of okay with Google reading your emails as long as it was a machine versus a human, right?
Yeah, but see Robodebt in Australia for details of where we can go wrong if people can't seek redress.
Oh no, yeah, I don't like that model, but I think it's.
I think if people were able to gain an explanation through an app of why a machine learning model was making decisions about their health based on things like their ethnicity, age, and location, I think they would soon be quite unhappy with it. Yeah.
Oh, yes, absolutely, right. This high level. So it's almost, you got this, right? You got hidden, noun that is making a decision, and then you got, you know, detailed explanation, right, of how, something like that, right?
So I think there's a explanation of what the input factors are. Sometimes you get things that say, you know, we made this decision and we used the following things. We considered the following, and then there's others. We made a decision and we considered the following, and this is kind of how we added them up in order to make the conclusion.
Yeah.
So as they show, you know, do you show your inputs or show the working?
I think you need to show both, right?
It's a privacy notice thing too. You should be stating which data you're gathering is contributing to what purpose, to what output. So it should have been worked out up front, as well as been factored into being able to address a subject request or whatever happens later.
So I was trying to say there's two. I was trying to say there's two levels here. There's one where you explain the decision and the input factors, which is like, we made this decision. In making this decision, we considered ABC. And then there's show your working, which is the next level, which is, you know, we added A to B and found it was greater than C, and that's why the decision was made.
Yeah, I really like that. So is this right? So sorry, detailed explanation of input factors, right?
Yeah.
And then how
and
the
then
decision was made.
Yeah, that's good.
And you know, the thing about this, right, is this throws a massive spanner to a lot of the machine learning, you know, teams, because when you ask them how the hell that thing, how is actually that work, they struggle. Which you can argue that, you know, if this is being used to determine it's a cat versus a dog, it's okay. But if this is now being used to affect serious people's lives or companies or you know, when, for example, you know, to shut down a company, right, to shut down a restaurant, right, what was the decision points that we use to shut down that restaurant, right? It could be that, you know, you had 10 offending things. It could be that, you know, you had, like, a very interesting one I was thinking is that if a restaurant, for example, doesn't clean up effectively, right, it means that you will have an infection point the next day that wasn't caused by a new agent coming in. Does that make sense? So if you think about it, the beauty of this data point is you should be able to see it coming, right? You should totally be able to see an infection person coming down the street, right? Going to that restaurant, you know, and then you should see the healthy ones coming out of it. And then eventually they should be, you know, mapped out, which is why I actually think that you also should track the testing, right, of some of the data, because I think that you should be able to, that's a good data point on this. But cool. Look, this is exactly what I was trying to get. I hope it made a bit of sense and it helped a bit.
Yeah, it was great. No, I think I'll start thinking about how we can do something like this to communicate where we are. And
Sarah, you're going to help to try to visualize this a little bit and try to put, you know, this into more of a kind of a framework and an understanding.
If folk want my inputs, they're welcome to reach out. Absolutely.
And cool. Anybody else on the line wants to have a quick comment? I realized it was mainly 4 or 5 of us that kept talking. And if not, I think we're cool. Right, look, thanks everybody. I think this was my favorite sessions, I have to say.
Great.
We created something, right? Like what I like about this is we moved the needle, we created something, you know, we zoomed in on the stuff. So I feel that, for example, like from a technical point of view, I have enough meat now here, right, to create a first pass where, you know, up until now, you know, it was just a bunch of ideas in the air, right? And I think, Sarah, some of the research that you were talking about, you know, even the conversation we had yesterday, I think this approach has a lot of scalability capabilities.
Yeah, it's exciting.
So cool. So I'm going to stop recording.